Welcome to Oil and Gas Law with Energy Law Prof. We're going to be talking about moratoria on energy development. In most of this course, we talk about state regulation of oil and gas production because states regulate most oil and gas production. But we, in this class, are going to talk about local limits on oil and gas production, how those can conflict with state level regulation of oil and gas, and we're going to talk about some of the proposed and actual federal limits on oil and gas production. So, first we're going to talk about this case, Range Resources versus Salem. This is in the High Court of Pennsylvania, 2009. It's on page 814 in your textbooks. Now, in this case, there's a township that regulates surface and land use of oil and gas drilling, and the Supreme Court says, no, the Oil and Gas Act of the state of Pennsylvania preempts this because this ordinance is trying to regulate the exact same things that the act regulates. Now, after this case, the Pennsylvania legislature says, yeah, this is great. We preempted those local regulations limiting oil and gas production. You know what? We're going to go even further. We are going to preempt zoning to the extent that if those local areas want to establish zoning regulations, you have to send them to us first to check them out to make sure they won't interfere with oil and gas development. On that case, the Pennsylvania High Court goes the other way and it says, no, the legislature can't limit the kind of typical zoning regulation, in part because of environmental rights provisions of the Pennsylvania Constitution. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court says, no, these local communities can regulate zoning in ways that might have some incidental impact on oil and gas development. So generally, if you're in a state where there's an oil and gas act and it doesn't make provision for local communities to do what they want, what's happened in most cases is that the courts have said that's going to preempt those local bans on oil and gas production or that local regulation of oil and gas production. Now, a caveat to that is there's two caveats that are probably important. One is that the state can give those local communities their authority to limit or ban oil and gas development. And Colorado, after a case held that those local communities were preempted from regulating oil and gas development, the state decided to give them that authority to regulate oil and gas development. The other caveat is that although those local communities might not have the right to simply ban oil and gas production, there are many local regulations that have an incidental impact on energy production and oil and gas regulation. So when you're going to develop oil and gas, you're going to need lots of local permits. You might need a local permit just to bring heavy equipment down a country road. You may need a local permit to shut down a road if you need to bring some equipment in. You're going to have to think about how you comply with zoning regulation. Are you trying to bring an industrial use into an area that's zoned for residential? So there's always going to be some gray area which allows those local communities to find ways to hold up oil and gas development, and it's going to be a balancing act in each state about how much those local community actions are going to be preempted by state law supporting the oil and gas industry. This can be very important in other industries quite apart from oil and gas. So this is a picture of the state of Iowa, one of the most important wind producers in the U.S., and this is from a study that looked at where you would need to put wind turbines across Iowa to meet some of our goals for higher production of renewable electricity. You can see that in light blue on this picture. That is showing you all the places that there would have to be significant wind turbines. Now, what I want you to see is, and what this study was looking at, is that many of those counties where wind turbines are projected to be built and will need to be built to meet our renewable goals have prohibited or complete bans on new wind turbines. So, you can look at this area where there's just a ban on new wind turbines, where in theory, we need them to meet some of our renewable goals. So these challenges that the oil and gas industry faces in terms of local bans or very prohibitive local regulation are an issue for other kinds of energy as well as for energy transport. I've just written a new article. It's a white paper with the American Enterprise Institute. You can find it at this link discussing exactly this problem. Okay, so that's the local side. Let's think about the federal side as well, because during the last presidential election, President Biden put forward a very radical proposal to limit oil and gas development on federal lands, which includes, of course, the Gulf Coast, and the Gulf of Mexico, but also federal lands like those in New Mexico on the New Mexico side of the Permian Basin. And what you can see here in this promise is that President Biden promised to ban new oil and gas permitting on public lands and waters. That would have been an extremely radical ban because you know from conservation law, you always have to have a permit to drill a new oil and gas well. So that would have put an end to drilling on public lands. Now that would have been hugely important because, as you know, public lands produce a large percentage, roughly a quarter of oil and gas in the United States. And if that had happened, it would have had a catastrophic effect on U.S. oil production and thus, of course, global oil and gas prices as the world has become very dependent on U.S. oil and U.S. natural gas to meet its needs. And, there's also, of course, a fairness objection, which is that this would have banned permits for new wells even on land that oil and gas companies had already taken leases on. They'd already paid a bonus for a lease, but this would make that lease worthless by saying you can't drill on it. Now, after President Biden came into office, he actually pretty quickly walked back this in part and said, you know what, I'm not going to ban all permits. I'm just going to put a pause on leasing. So if you already have a lease, you may have a chance to go ahead and drill if you can pass your environmental review and I issue a permit. But if you are looking for a new lease, new land to lease for development, I'm not going to give that to you right now. Now, since that time, President Biden's policy on oil and gas leasing has kind of gone back and forth several times, and it's sometimes been unclear whether he's hoping for less production to help reduce carbon emissions or more production to try and lower oil and gas prices. And I think probably the best way to see what he's been hoping to do is by looking at how much he's actually leased for oil and gas development. So he hasn't taken the most radical action of stopping permits on existing leases, but if you look at how much he's been willing to grant new leases, you can see that it is at record low levels and completely out of line with what happened under previous administrations. So in this recent report from September in the Wall Street Journal, it says Biden administration has leased fewer acres for oil and gas drilling offshore and on federal land than any other administration in its early stages dating back to the end of World War II. To contrast with what happened under President Obama, in 2009, the first year under President Obama, Interior held 35 onshore oil and gas lease sales, and by contrast, in its first year, the Biden administration had none. So I think if you're wondering, is the Biden administration really trying to boost oil and gas production to lower prices, or are they really trying to limit oil and gas production to reduce carbon emissions? It seems like they're more trying to reduce oil and gas production to lower carbon emissions.